A group of conservative Christian evangelicals have banded together to assail David Barton's work, his credibility, and really, to me, they're questioning everything about David Barton, and it's perplexing to me. It's perplexing to me because I know David Barton, and most of these men do as well. And it has perplexed me for a while as to why this is happening. I think I have some answers, but I think it's healthier for us to assume that the motives behind this campaign, and that's what it is, a campaign against one of America's most respected people, are decent and pure. That it is really, truly, their motivation is just a quest for truth and the truth only. That's what we're going to do tonight. I believe that after hearing the specific allegations, most likely you're not going to come to that conclusion. You will feel that there's something else going on. But I want you to watch tonight and arrive at your own decision. Personally, that doesn't matter if there's something else going on. What does matter is, what is the truth? And then let the chips fall where they may. Truth should be our only quest. I've known David for many, many years. David has played a critical role in almost everything that I have done in the last few years. He has been by my side, and he is a wise and generous counsel. I leave out the wise and generous counsel of his wife, Cheryl, much to my shame. She is always there. She is a rock. These two people are the salt of the earth. They are people, as a Christian, you can look at as a man and say, wow, I hope I can be half of that person. He is gentle, kind, and humble, and most importantly, honest. Now, the Southern Poverty Law Center fears David. They say he's a dangerous extremist, and I, think they could unleash a devastating, red, white, and blue shirt fashion trend scare on America, because, boy, when he wears that, I mean, that's about as scary as David ever gets. But I have never seen David close-minded. I've never seen him close-minded to people or opinions or conclusions contrary to his own. He is a seeker and a searcher. I have never seen him unwilling to learn something new. I have never seen him insist that he is right when the facts demonstrate otherwise. I have been in many rooms with many, many, many people where that is not true. David is not one of those people. If there is a selfish bone in his body, let me tell you, he is the best at hiding that. He is the worst self-promoter of all time. I remember when the Jefferson Lies came out, which is the book we're going to discuss tonight, I had offered to write the foreword for it. And some time had gone by, and I asked one of my producers, when did that David Barton book come out? And they checked, and they found out that it had been out for a week already. Where have you been, Glenn? Busy, but still talking to David Barton. I had no idea that it had been released, even though I had spoken to David that week. He never asked me to promote his book. He has never asked me to promote anything. Here or at Fox, on the radio, nothing, ever, period. Almost no one in my life has ever done that. And I say almost, I mean, I want to say that so I can add my wife to the list. Everybody has an angle. David does not. He is a terrible self-promoter, but I think a better way to describe him is he is a selfless servant, which makes him so powerful and, quite frankly, so frightening to so many. There are no ulterior motives going on with David Barton that I have ever seen even a hint of. I insist he comes on the program because I believe it is critical for Americans to hear this man speak. I believe David Barton is one of the most important voices, if not the most important voice in America today. For the next 60 minutes, we're going to let the chips fall where they may, with malice toward none, and charity toward all. We will assume the best of people that have come out and said things. We will be firm, but I am going to ask David to explain some of these charges. The tagline for this network is "The truth has no agenda," because God has no agenda. David is here to respond tonight to all of the comments and accusations being made about him. About 4 months ago, I got a visit in my office from a friend who said I needed to help David Barton. I needed to help change David Barton's way because David was so seriously misguided. I was shocked and quite frankly a little uncomfortable because the conversation did not happen with David, it happened with me. I would be uncomfortable if one of my friends came to somebody else instead of me. I called David right after, and I said, "David, you know, this is going on. I didn't think he needed saving, but I expressed a concern of another friend. I thought it was pretty much over. Then, at the Restoring Love event, there were meetings that were going on, and right after the event, I received a letter from a prominent Christian that had just unleashed on David. In this letter, they claimed, quote, David was not trustworthy in his treatment of the founders and the circumstances surrounding the founding of America, and therefore they could, quote, not depend on any work being done by wall builders, end quote. This letter explained how fearful they were of David's, quote, potentially damaging work gaining in popularity, end quote. This letter cited Michelle Bachmann's embarrassing statement during her presidential campaign, which was provided by David Barton as evidence of this fear. I have to tell you something. That statement was about the founders' views on slavery and the 3/5 clause. At the time, if you are a listener of my radio program, I came out in defense of Michelle Bachmann. I didn't know that that fact had come from David Barton at the time, but I defended Michelle because what she was trying to say was 100% correct. She just presented it poorly. In their research into David's facts, they found, quote, serious critiques that came, not surprisingly, and I am quoting, mostly from left-wing blogs. No. But, they argued, just because something is said by leftists doesn't mean it's not true. That's fair. That's fair enough. But just because a Christian leader says it doesn't mean it's true either. Just because a professor says it, it doesn't mean it's true either. Just because a guy on television says it doesn't make it true. The list of complaints and accusations and arguments goes into several things. And David will answer many or most of them tonight if we have time. I have great respect for David Barton, but I have more respect for the truth. The one thing that is definitely true is a good man is being smeared. Some things need to be left unsaid. David lost his contract with his book. And I am going to point out this publisher, Thomas Nelson. They should be embarrassed. If this book that David wrote is littered with so many errors, how did you not find them? I've been a writer for several years now. I have published, I believe, 10 or 12 New York Times bestsellers. 8 of them are #1. Simon & Schuster combs through every word, every fact. I had 18 researchers on the George Washington book. If Thomas Nelson didn't do the same on David Barton's book, they should go out of business. How can you trust anything that Thomas Nelson puts out if they will just release an important book like this one and they didn't check any of the facts? How could I possibly trust any book from Thomas Nelson? I said on the radio today, with malice toward none, I will not promote another Thomas Nelson book because they either do amazingly shoddy work or They dropped David Barton after being contacted and intimidated by a group of people attacking David. That is no different of an approach than Van Jones and the left when they disagree with someone. They try to silence them. It doesn't matter if you're left or right, Christian or atheist, it doesn't matter. We will not buckle to pressure groups. We live in a country where we can disagree with each other. We're talking about history. Since when was history one way? When? When did we start locking? When did the church start locking people in the tower because they have a different view? Are we really entering the book-burning days? And I know a lot of people will say this isn't book-burning, but Thomas Nelson, let me ask you, what are you going to do with those books? If you don't burn them, I guess you could recycle them. You could go into a bookstore now, and Thomas Nelson will not allow a bookstore to sell the book written by David Barton. You decide tonight if that's right or wrong. I want you to come to your own conclusion. After you've had a personal chat with a friend of mine, David Barton, as we search for the truth, as Jefferson said himself, question with boldness even the very existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more approve the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear. I know that sounds a little different than the way I normally quote him, but on tonight's show, I wanted to make sure I got it exactly right, because I'm sure the footnotes of this program are going to be checked. This is what we're going to do tonight. And let the facts and the chips fall where they may. Before we go to the Bibles and some of the history, I just want to start with this. One of them is that you don't provide enough facts. There's not enough facts here. And you went back and looked through the edits from Thomas Nelson.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Do you have that with you?
I don't. It's offset. We can
Can
get
you
it a break.
grab somebody, Cheryl, if you're around?
It's in my briefcase.
Just grab it. Because we save our edited manuscripts.
Yeah.
Because the process is important.
Yeah.
You obviously do the same thing. And you have, you found the original manuscript and the edits. Can you explain what this is? Explain what it is.
A lot of the complaints that Throckmorton had about not documentation on it were sections that Thomas Nelson pulled out of the book when they did their edits.
What does he mean by there's no documentation?
Well, you know, it's interesting. The documentation is there. He just doesn't like it. I'll give you one example. For one of the things he really harps on is what's called the Jefferson Bible. And so in the Jefferson Bible, we say, look, there are several editions of the Jefferson Bible out there.
Go ahead.
Because in the 1804 edition, what Jefferson did, this is close to what Jefferson had in 1804. There were two Bibles like this in the White House. Now, that's not the same, but that's what they looked like. That's a later edition. And what he did was he opened those up, and he went through and cut out the passages and put them all together, and he told his friends, this is what we can use with Indians, because you can read the life of Christ here. One of the things that I say is I contend that the passages he cut out included several miraculous supernatural things that the scholars say, oh no, he would never do that, ever do that. So the first guy to really do a reconstruction of it was a guy named Dickinson Adams. Dickinson Adams, back in the 60s and 70s, went and got those two Bibles, looked at every section cut out by Jefferson. Jefferson also did a handwritten list of what he was going to include in this work, and he also wrote the title page for it.
So he went back to the original
Bible
Bible
back to the originals.
that was sitting in the White House that had everything cut out.
That's right.
Okay.
And so he went through, and what they found was there were 16 passages that Jefferson had cut out, passages out of the Gospels telling the story of Jesus. What happened was when Dickinson Adams redid that, and this is done scholarly press, he did that. It turns out he didn't put all the passages in there. He went through and he says right here that he left out 4.5 passages because he couldn't really believe that Jefferson believed the stuff that he cut out of the Gospels. So he made an editorial decision that even though Jefferson cut it out and put it in his manuscript, I'm not going to include it because I don't really think he believed it.
So the original 1804 Bible that Jefferson made, cut and paste, doesn't exist anymore.
It doesn't.
But the two Bibles where the verses were cut from,
yeah.
So we have to piece out what was in that Bible.
That's right.
And they're making the case that there's no miracles. So he doesn't believe that Jesus is divine. That's the case they're trying to make.
That's what this guy, he said, I don't believe Jefferson thought Jesus was divine.
In 1960, he says that.
It is in 60s and 70s when he's doing his work. So what happens is 2 more editions come out in the 80s and 90s, these 2. And they said, you know, we went back to the Bibles, and we're going to include what Jefferson himself did and let that speak for himself.
Right.
Jefferson's own work. So they come out with it. And so when I do the Jefferson Lies, I point out, all right, here's the 3 versions of Jefferson's Bible. Now, there's some difference between them because this guy cut some stuff out. These guys included it. And I said, you look at all of them, I'm going to include what was in the actual Bible. So Throckmorton comes out and says, oh, everybody knows it's not in there because Dickinson Adams is the authority on it. Dickinson Adams tells you in his footnote that he personally did not agree with what Jefferson did, so he's taken it out. Now, that's a problem.
Let me tell you something, David. This is one conversation that I had with a friend who is one of them standing against you and me now. And I said to him, look, what's happening here is, in many cases, it is a scholar building on top of another scholar, on top of another scholar. You have to go back to the original source, not to what somebody else said. They may have been a Christian, they may have been a conservative, they may have had pure intent. They may have. But this will tell the story, not something that was written.
An interpretation of it.
Yes.
And see, that's why we did this, because we wanted to let Jefferson talk for himself. We said, hey, he's got 19,000 writings. Rather than letting a professor interpret it, why don't we just look at his writings? And that's what drives these guys crazy. And so in the critique, he quotes all the professors who said, oh, that's wrong.
Okay, so you don't have to go to the little purple book and the other pink book. You go to those 2 books.
That's right. You go
see those 2 books.
And what you've got right there is you can see 16, you can find 16 sections he cut out of those 2. And he had to use 2 books because sometimes you have one on this side and one on the other. You know,
right. So he cuts them out, and this proves what we're trying to prove is that he believed in the miracles of Jesus Christ.
That's right.
Right?
And he cut them out and put them in.
Right. Okay. So,
but the scholars don't agree that he would have done that. They think that's out of, because they start with the assumption that Jefferson is not a very religious guy.
Right.
And therefore anything that contradicts that, they just go the other way.
So I want to go to this now. And I want you to take a close look. This is what a manuscript looks like. This is chapter 4 of David's book. Now, explain what this is, David.
This is the section on Jefferson and the Bible, and Jefferson and what were called subscriptions to this Bible here, which
we're going to get to here in a second.
And so, in talking about Jefferson's views on the Bible, we go through and provide page after page of his quotes, his writings, and his statements.
Okay. So when they say there's not enough documentation, and Thomas Nelson says, hey, well, we didn't know all of this stuff, and we had some real questions. I want to show you. The black is what was left in after which edit was this? Was this the final edit?
This is final edit.
Okay. So the black is what was left in. The red is what was taken out by Thomas Nelson.
Those are all red pages.
So if you want to see if David had enough documentation, what was removed from this book, you delivered a, how many words?
85,000.
85,000 word. How many words is that?
Oh, my.
50?
Well, this here is 63,000.
Okay.
So, you know, add another 30%.
Okay. So they took 20,000 words of documentation out of it. All right. There's another charge that your critics are making that I think is a simple misunderstanding, and it revolves around these. This is so easy to understand if you understand something. If you would have had this charge with me even 3 years ago, I don't think I would understand this. But because I understand the new cutting-edge technology, I can explain this. Explain what the controversy is here.
This is a cutting-edge Bible that came out in 1798 that used a brand new printing process that had never been known called hot press printing, where they actually heated and seared the ink into the page. This is the largest Bible printed in America to that time. And
this is great.
Yeah, it is. It's cool. This is the John Thompson hot press Bible.
Okay. And in your book, you say that Jefferson, you don't say sponsored it. You say sponsored it?
Financially, he invested in.
Invested in. Okay, all right. And what your critics are saying is he didn't sponsor that. He didn't invest in that. He just bought it. Explain.
It's called subscription. Unlike today, where that we go get a loan and then print a book and get sales back in. Back then, they wouldn't print the book if they couldn't pay for it all up front. So what they would do is they would approach potential buyers and said, if you're interested in buying this book, we'll go ahead and, if we can get a commitment from you to buy, if you'll subscribe to this book, we'll print it. So a lot of times publishers would not print their books because they couldn't get enough people willing to buy it. Jefferson said, you bet, I'll subscribe to this. And his name is listed in the back, along with a bunch of other signers, Declaration, Constitution, as helping finance this. So once they get their list of subscribers, they know they can print it and not lose money. So they didn't go into debt. It's interesting, Jefferson did that, and these guys, the professors, raised a big ruckus about, oh no, a subscriber's not an investor. So I went back to the 1828 Noah Webster's Dictionary, closest to that time, and yeah, a subscriber's an investor. It's giving an IOU to the printer that says, here's the money I'm going to give you. You can take this to go get the book printed. That's an investment in that book.
Okay. Let me give you the real life today example. Can you put this up on the web screen, on the big screen here, Tiffany? You know what I'm talking about, Tiff? What'd you say? Yes. Put Kickstart up, please. You ever heard of Kickstart?
I was told about it just before we started.
Yeah. I'm sitting in a meeting today, and I said, well, this is Kickstart. Okay. What Kickstart is somebody has an idea, and they say, I want to do this idea. And so you invest in it. You may only invest $10. Well, most people will think a big-time investor, you have to put a lot of money in.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
They'll do it $10 a day.
Yeah.
You help them, and they don't make it unless they make enough money.
That's right.
This was the Kickstart of our day. Kickstarter was this. It was just done without the technology. And in that time, Kickstarter was called Subscriber.
It was. And what's interesting is when we saw these 23 charges, we went through them, went back and looked at the stuff, we found out that not only did Jefferson subscribe to this Bible, he subscribed to other Bibles as well. He was willing to put his money into other Bibles, which completely drives these guys crazy. We didn't know he did an 1807 subscription to what was called Scott's Bible. And that we do have in the book that he offered to financially fund Charles Thompson in publishing his two religious works. But, I mean, what they've done is say, oh, you got subscriber wrong, therefore the whole book is wrong. No, I can prove that that's a subscriber, an investor, and you just did it with Kickstart.
Okay, let me go, when we come back, to the slavery issue. Because this one is big. And they say that it really, truly discredits you.
Yeah.
And it's really not that complex if you take yourself into their time and then understand the government regulations that we have here today and say, oh, okay, I understand that. Let me look at what was happening back then, and you'll understand it. Thomas Jefferson on slavery, next. I'm going to be real candid with you here, David, and maybe I'm wrong. But a lot of the stuff on, see, the left has Jefferson because he's the separation of church and state.
Yeah.
And there's some things, like if we have time, I want to get to the Virginia, but I doubt we're going to have time. But we will on another date.
Yeah.
There are some things that are confusing about him.
There are.
He's the American Sphinx.
Yeah.
And he also doesn't have a simple or a traditional view of the Godhead, if you will.
Yeah.
He doesn't see the Trinity.
Yeah.
I'm a Mormon. I don't see the Trinity either. I recognize God the Father, the Holy Ghost, and Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is my Savior. He atoned for my sins. I must go through Jesus Christ to obtain salvation. Have to. Got it. But because I have that difference, same difference with Jefferson, because I have that, people claim I'm not a Christian. That, I think, is what some of this is they're saying, no, it's not our definition of Christian. I don't care what your definition of Christian. Jefferson's definition, my definition, now it may not be your definition of Christian, but his definition, my definition is Jesus Christ is my Savior. If you don't like it, I'll be taking it up with him. And believe me, he'll let me know in the end.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what is in some ways happening with some of the deep theologians. They can't let that difference be called a Christian, because then it opens up too many cans of worms that are trouble. Do you think that's fair or not?
I think that's fair in several ways. One is because if you take the 2,000-year history of the Christian church, that has been one of the most debated doctrines ever.
Right.
Number two is if you go into the Reformation, many of the Reformation leaders had opposite opinions on that. Now, from my standpoint, I don't. I've got a simple opinion.
You and I disagree on this, but we both find each other Christian.
And what you've got with Jefferson, and this is what I point out in the book, he's a really complex guy. You cannot make him monolithic.
Right.
There are other times when he says the Apostles' Creed is right. Well, the Apostles' Creed does have the Godhead Trinity. So Jefferson's got contradictory statements here, but the whole point we make is he's not hostile to religion. He's not hostile to Christianity. He calls himself a Christian. Right. It may be a different definition from what other people's call.
That's okay.
But he's not calling for a secular public square.
Correct.
And that's where we are.
Okay. The problem here I see is that we have this pass with the right that is that if we take this apart and we cannot deem him Christian, the left is celebrating.
Yeah,
because the left says
he
hated Christians, which is not true.
Yeah.
And I can't believe that a religion who is based on don't judge won't listen to his own words. And he says he's a Christian.
As I've told reporters, fortunately, I'm not the great judge.
Right.
I'm not the one that has to decide whether he goes to heaven or hell or whatever. You know, I'm not the one who has to do that.
Right.
But I am the one to say that by his own writings, this is what he said, this is what he did. And it is not a secular guy. It is not an anti-Christian guy. He is one of the biggest pro-Jesus guys out there. You know, sometimes his definition later in life may vary from what it was earlier. That's why he's complex.
You know, I tell you, David, I find myself in many times in agreement with Thomas Jefferson on things. And I feel, and mainly this, I know what I know.
Yeah.
I know what I believe. And I stand by that. But in the end, if you're right, that it's 3 in 1, I'm going to be dealing with it up there, and I'm fine with that too.
Yeah.
I am fine with that.
Yeah.
It is, I just try to live my life.
That's right.
And Jefferson was the same way.
Yeah.
He wasn't trying to put people out of business. He just believed what he believed. Am I wrong on that?
No, you're exactly right on that. And that's why he was a supporter of virtually every denomination.
And he was also afraid of religions, as all of our founders were, because they saw religion getting in bed with government. And when that happened, then you had real problems.
Actually, I would change it. They saw government getting in bed with religion.
Yes.
Because in all cases since 391 A.D. with Theodosius, it was the state who took over the church. And they were less concerned about the church taking over the state than the state taking over the church.
Correct.
So,
okay, well, that's the way we've flipped it now.
Yeah, we say church and state meaning keep the church out. They said church and state meaning keep the state
out of church.
Exactly.
Okay. All right, I want to get to the slavery issue, because this one is so disturbing, and so it's complex but easy to understand once you grasp it. Okay. They say Jefferson was not against slavery. He did not want to release his slaves. He was, conflicted on this.
Well, not on releasing the slaves.
No, he was conflicted on a guy who writes, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator.
Owning slaves.
Owns
He's conflicted.
slaves.
That's
He's
right.
conflicted.
That's right.
But again, it's like Al Gore flying a private jet, but saying that you shouldn't fly.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But there's something else that goes on, and the critics say that he did not free his slaves. You say it's because he had to pay a fine and taxes.
Well, no, actually, I say that you could free your slaves at death. George Washington did.
Yes.
And I say that because of the laws, you couldn't free your slaves. And so they take that 1782 law where you can free slaves at death. And that 1782 law also contains a clause that says you can emancipate your slaves during your life. Oh, Barton left that out. That proves that he's trying to cook the books. And the point I make throughout the whole chapter is there's a whole bunch of laws Jefferson had to deal with. So Professor Throckmorton comes back, his whole rebuttal is based on that 1782 law.
By the way, Professor Throckmorton, what era of history is he, a professor or or a professor in?
You're talking the guy who's criticizing me, who's a professor of psychology at Grove College?
Okay, yeah, so he's not a professor of history.
No, he's a professor of psychology.
Criticizing you because you don't have the credentials.
The credentials and the content.
Right, okay, got it. Okay, so the professor of psychology.
And he's recruited others to join in the fray, and so he's got all these academics that now has,
Okay, so anyway, he says that...
that clause of the law that Jefferson that says you could emancipate your slaves during your life, see, the problem is, I only brought 3. Let's go 7 volumes of Virginia law books here. Okay. He quoted the 1782 law. He just forgot to quote the 1778 law, the 1791 law, the 1793 law, the 1795 law, the 1798 law, the 1802 law, all the other numerous laws that dealt with it. And Jefferson had to deal not with one law. And so you've got this thing where he says, oh, you can emancipate your slaves if you want to. Got a quote here from a guy who corresponded with Jefferson. His name is Edward Coles. He was the private secretary to James Madison, a friend of Jefferson. He said, you see Edward Coles here. And he writes, Jefferson says, I've got to get out of Virginia. He says, I've only been principled against slavery, but have had feelings so repugnant to it as to decide me not to hold them, slaves, which decision has forced me to leave my native state and with it all my relations and friends.
Okay, leaving a state back then, remember, there's no telephones, there's nothing. There's no airplanes to jump on. And leaving Virginia, if you've ever lived in Virginia, I have, you're not a Virginian to Virginians.
That's right.
You know, unless you were born there, you're not a Virginian. Leaving back then is a very big deal.
Big deal.
Okay.
And he says, I have to leave all my relations and friends because unless I get out of the state, I can't free my slaves. Now, if Professor Throckmorton's right that he could have just emancipated them, then why didn't he? Because Jefferson wrote back and said the laws, plural, do not allow us to free them. Not one law. Professor Throckmorton quotes one. It's the laws.
And this is how I want you to understand this, America. If you're a small businessman and you try to go into business, they'll say to you, you can go into business, sure. But try to build your business. It's not one law.
That's right.
It's a series of laws that make it so financially obscene, you cannot do it. Why, when Jefferson died in the end, what was he concerned with his money? Was he concerned at all about
what money?
Yeah, exactly right. Explain that.
Now, see, what happened is if you free your slaves, another law said if you emancipate your slaves, you got to provide security bonds for certain types. And so we don't want slaves to be drained on the state. We want free slaves out of the state within a year. If they come back in, we can... and so it's just really complicated. Jefferson doesn't have income. He had to sell his cherished library just to raise enough funds to be able to survive.
Listen to this, America. The Library of Congress, the original Library of Congress, he sold to the United States government. He loved it. He sold it because? Because
he didn't have economic income. So how are you going to security bond all your slaves? And by the way, he inherited 187 slaves when he's 14 years old. So why didn't he just release them? Because Virginia law says if you're an adolescent, you cannot free any slave you've been given. You cannot emancipate any slave. I mean, so he's now got 187 slaves he's not been allowed to free.
But it's also slaves at that time were assets. If you lose your slaves and you have this big farm, you have nothing.
You know what else? I was told by a guy who has 2 masters on this. He said, well, the slaves actually, Jefferson didn't know, and they belonged to the creditors. And so he couldn't sell the slaves because he was in debt so much that they actually had... He said, we were taught that from the very start in our postgraduate stuff, that Jefferson didn't have the option because he was already in debt and the creditors had his slaves. So I haven't checked that out, but I do know it's a complicated thing. I do know there were folks who freed their slaves, but they could provide security bonds. They had more money. They could do the things. They had smaller groups. Not Jefferson. It's really complicated.
David, in 40 seconds, anything here that anything that's on your heart that you want to share?
Truth wins out. I mean, that's why we put 768 footnotes in this thing. That's why we want people to go check the documents for yourself. Don't buy into what some critic says and what scholar says. Look, know truth yourself. Go get it yourself.
David's saying this. He's not saying this to anybody to go buy the book, because you can't buy the book anymore because they've pulled it off the shelves. They're going to recycle the paper or burn the book. I don't know what they're going to do with it, but they've pulled it off. Mercury has every intention of republishing this book with all of the updates in it, so you can see it. If you have a copy of this book, it's now a collector's item.
That's right. In the meantime, we do have it at wallbuilders.com, so we've still got
good.
some.
All
We've still got it in stock.
Here's the one thing that I would add. David is a good man. I know some of the people that are coming after David right now, and they're good men too. There are times that we have a difference of opinion. There are times that, you know, facts are facts, and we just have to come together and be decent to each other. Be together on things. We're all serving the same God. From Dallas, good night, America.